Visual canon, the age wave, and the false choice in Star Trek. Today, Trekland Tuesdays live, number 349, with me, Dr. Trek, Larry Nemecek, coming at you here from the heart of Trekland, Portal 47, and yes, Trekland Treks, your custom away mission, personal away mission for here in Southern California. Home of all that, for once again, another Tuesday on Wednesday, for some sanity, clarity, and the big picture in all things Star Trek. Hello, YouTube folks. Please make sure and comment on today's little soapbox. I bet you will. And then try to join us live sometime on Tuesday afternoon, right? We're global. There, I try to stay on top of things. I try not to be repetitive. I try not to repeat the general internet. I always say, Trekland, Dr. Trek tries to bring you not the same old. Try to get ahead of trends. Try to connect dots in a different way. But I feel like today, I'm just going to have to get into this. But I'm going to bring you some dots that don't always all get connected. We may hit some points that have been in the news lately, but then I'm going to circle the wagons and bring us back around a couple things that maybe have not been said, have not been aired out. So bear with me, stay with me. I guess the channel's doing better because we've had more people showing up for this in comments later on. And Second Opinion, which is now weekly every time there's fresh Trek, right? Not a hot take, not a quick take, but a second opinion from Dr. Trek. I hope you're following along and watching that because the comments there are starting to explode. And I guess the Trekland YouTube channel here is crossing back onto the radar because we're starting to pick up comments from the folks that I thought had gone away over 7 years. Anyway, it's getting interesting. And again, I enjoy free speech. I enjoy an actual, honest, sincere exchange of opinions. It's when people, even if they're not paid trolls, even if they're not botting, if their whole psyche is about just doing the thing. I'm just amazed that people haven't changed their tune in 7 years. I just want to go, really? Really? Is this 2017 still? It's amazing. But you can't anticipate what people do with their time and their life, and a lot of it's sad, apparently. Again, I don't begrudge anybody their opinion. I'm just saying, if you feel the need to say the same opinion constantly for 7 or 8 years, maybe it's time to find something else in your life that's not just eating you up with negativity. And I'm saying all this because, yes, we're going to go there today. We're going to go there today on visual canon and a look back at some of the things I've been saying over the years already, but maybe in a slightly different way. Because another intersecting point was a couple of news stories I saw this week, not about visual canon, but about Star Trek and favorites. And it gets back to the point. When I say the age wave, I mean the demo wave. Because this is the thing you hear me talk about, blinders and getting out of your comfort zone and your groove. Sometimes you're aware of it, but a lot of times with Star Trek, and in a world that moved slower, and in a world where we didn't have new Star Trek for 12 years, and in a world before that where we had so much new Star Trek, people couldn't keep up with it, and the audience divided, and the viewership for DS9 and Voyager shrank away until there was no handoff to Enterprise, from the highs of the 90s to the lows of the aughts, and then nothingness. I mean, it's always a shifting, evolving picture. We all committed our own time to Star Trek, no matter where across the decades that was. And I always say, you never forget your first. And that was one of the first respect points for even the JJ movies, even the Kelvinverse. And I say that more about the science of math. I got over my guilt about not caring more about the Kelvins when I realized there would never be more than maybe 4 movies. And I said this as I grappled my way to figuring out why me, a long-line fan, booster, someone who knows that, not a shill, but if you actively root for the doom of any Star Trek entry, then you're going to be hurting the franchise. And maybe you can afford to sit back and play perfect God and wait for the absolute perfect combination of producer, writer, actors, cast, design team. Maybe you can afford to sit back and do that, but the real world doesn't, because the real world is still capitalism based, and there are bean counters and there are mundane suits who don't know anything about Star Trek, unfortunately, and we treasure it when one of them sneaks in to take over and get the keys. But that's not always. Sometimes we have to have the enablers do it to let those people get the keys. And when we have it and all the gears are turning together, we have the well-oiled machine. Oh, it is Star Trek. It is Star Trek. What's a heaven in Star Trek? Nirvana, but that's so mundanely Earth. That's not always the case. And we have to just do what we can to wait through. And it's amazing what happens as the eras go by. I'm saying all this because of all things, I call it the Breen episode, right? Mirrors last week seem to have brought all this out. Now, I'm telling you, if you watch Second Opinion, just as if I talk here, and I tell the Portales this when we're all in our Portal 47 club meetings, you know, I will call a spade a spade. I will critique something when I feel critique worthy. Maybe I won't rant on and on and on about it, but I'm not a vanilla person. And very few Star Trek is so chef's kiss that there's not something you can say, even if you view it not as I'm going to bash it because I hate it, which is the extreme position that never gets you anywhere, or it's like a yes and in improv. Okay, but, and you say, well, here's what was disappointing, and most of all, here's what I would have done differently. But apparently, still a chunk of fandom, and I'm so flattered and honored that they seem to have found me. You can go read comments in Second Opinion this week, but a lot of people, while I was amazed, and it was safe territory for a new Star Trek to take. The Breen. Okay, the Kellerans too. But the Breen. I was so, I don't say overcome, but I was so tickled to see so much finally solving the mystery of what the Breen helmet was. And then it wasn't just about cold, because that was going to be problematic. It smacks of another long-running canon mystery that I will get into in a minute, but it was really a different take. It was hearkening back to an Earth paradigm with deep sea insect life and deep sea fish life, marine life, and then also just the variety, the universality, the variety of God's creation, if you want to go there. But the diversity of all life, not just sentient life. The whole thing about the exoskeleton, the exo layer being soft or hard, and then blending into a cultural effect, ramifications, and over centuries and millennia. And I was so taken up with all that from the episode, plus the, human dramatic story of the characters and the other bits, that I didn't even think about the Enterprise sets and the ISS Enterprise, aside from the fact that, they did it to save money to advertise they used the Strange New sets. But apparently this really triggered some of our friends in the audience who once again brought it up that this was crazy, that this was the ISS Enterprise. Now, about design canon, and we've gone back to the whole 1960s bridge and design versus the teens and 20s design. So I'm going to say 3 or 4 things here, and then we're going to leapfrog into something else, but I want to get through all of this. Number one, because people use those points, those dots, those triggers to get back to the whole big picture about how modern Trek, it must be an alternate universe because it doesn't feel right. And I agree. Here's the thing, kids. I agree with a lot of this. On the surface, in the gut moment that you bring all your past Trek to it, I agree, but that's not the end of it. That's your first gut reaction. Okay. I want to go, because here's the thing. And let me go big picture on this first. I've seen people even bring up the Leonard Nimoy quote, where on the surface, it appears that Leonard is bashing trivia folks, bashing canon people. He even uses the C word. And he says, well, the thing about people who only talk about canon are that they're very petty and they just want to hold something over people who aren't as versed in it. Which, to me, to hear someone say that, it's like hearing anybody. We've heard Shatner take a lot of hits over saying things that shocked a chunk of the world, somewhere on the PC scale, if not the fandom PC scale. I remember times when, this is hard to believe, but right after Next Generation, Patrick said some outrageous things at conventions and live things, and I just chalked it up as the angst of the actor making a pivot in life and not knowing what's next. This is when he did some mean things on stage, especially to a little girl in the audience at the Grand Slam, when the next thing on the horizon was him playing a gay second banana in Jeffrey. I mean, the X-Men was way in the future. Generations was happening. But anything besides Star Trek, I would even, we've seen angst and career uncertainty make, and writers and all of our creatives, we all say unfortunate things out loud, and sometimes it comes from where we are. Okay. Leonard's quote here. I never see what the context is. I never see if he was answering somebody. If he was answering a stupid, petty situation, that could well have been his answer. But I see that quote, and now it's even been memeified, used as a cudgel to bash people. And we talk so much about gatekeeping, and I think of the broad swath of fandom because my moods change. My moods have changed over time. They have to, because Star Trek has changed, the world has changed, and I've changed over time. And all those people that swore they could never keep up with DS9 because they missed 2 shows and the damn thing went there. It was all the paradigm of how old they were. And you live in a world where it's you VCR it, you record it on your tape, or you've missed the episode and it's weekly, right? We live in a world with binge watching and instant availability now. The entire library. That's doesn't even make sense anymore. It's like explaining to a kid why you didn't make phone calls, why you didn't call people long distance because of the time. And if you did, you had to get up at 7 in the morning or 11 at night and not wake the person up. I mean, young people nobody understand. Like, what? A call's a call. It's no big deal. A call is one of the 47 things you can do with this device. And those are the things that affected people's opinions of shows. Okay, there's so many layers to this. Leonard's quote, number one, I don't know the context, who he was answering, what was going on. I know Leonard obviously did not care about bashing canon and continuity because he spoke up for it himself. How many times did Leonard speak up for the continuity of Spock? How many times did he change his mind about whether he wanted to play Spock or not? And I'm not bashing Leonard. That's the reality that we're all in. Now, if you can find me 5 or 6 or 7 times he said something to this effect, okay. But the upshot of this is people are using that meme to go bash the Canonistas. And as I say on the Trek Files, I say the term Canonistas lovingly because I came across that 10, 15 years ago before it got weaponized to talk about people who were canon devils who bashed that over themes and diversity and inclusion and whatever, all the hopeful, optimistic, aspirational aspects of Star Trek, which we all enjoy, but we all have our favorites. We all have our thing we go to beforehand. And we all have our thing we go to celebrate Star Trek. The original generation was all about fan fiction writing. It was all about fan fiction and zine. And that's the organized structure that clubs and then conventions largely came out of. A little bit on the vendors, dealers side. But that was the 2 camps. But yes, costume making, cosplay now, costumes, props, models, filling in the gaps of the universe. So when people use that today, when people rise up to say, this upsets me, it must be a different timeline because it doesn't make sense. And another half of the fandom who are so quick to talk about gatekeeping rightly as a term, it doesn't make, you can both be mutually shooting at each other about what's more important. And that is silly. I never denigrated shipping and the character work and the character building. It just wasn't the thing that was my turn on, but I appreciated it. I wasn't going to be as invested in the background of a show that had stupid writing and stupid characters. So if this is some perverse way of saying that I had the privilege of having a fairly stable middle-class white life to where some aspect of angst, whether it was worry about Vietnam and nuclear war and ecology. I mean, I was worried those were all issues, but I wasn't personally bound up with them with anxiety. I'm so thankful that I didn't have a personal life that was so dominated that the stability that Star Trek represented to so many people. Sometimes it was a health issue. Sometimes it was just the hell they might have been living in their personal life, and the rationality, much less the personality and charisma of the actors and the characters, and just seeing Spock be rational and knowing that was such a rarity in their own personal lives. So many people clung to Vulcans and rationality because of that. They saw that. Or just in the world at large, the culture at large, with that insanity of a war, insanity of pollution, insanity of racial hatred and inequality. And that was their thing. We all come to it. And I recognize that. But when you're 14 and 15 and 16, you're not thinking in big terms like that. Maybe you are. All I'm saying here is the thing that pulled me into Star Trek, in a world where I loved history, I loved NASA, and I read, and storytelling was not unknown to me. But that's what the hook was to me. I wanted to fill those gaps. Why didn't the tech manual have a page for everything? Well, because it wasn't financially feasible. You had to put a limit. You had to do something. You had to make some choices. You couldn't do everything. But when you're a kid, you want it all. And when I was a volunteer for the Well Committee in the pre-computer days, and fandom was stamps and paper driven, and SACES, self-addressed stuff, that's the first thing I reached out for. I had a list of the 8-page letter with just question. And the poor people that were trying to answer me, I always think of them when I'm answering people's questions, whether it's in Portal 47 and it's a business now, or whether we're just in some comment thread. Because this is the thing, getting back to Leonard's quote. People that, number one, I'm gonna anti-gatekeep here for canonistas and background fans. It is important to them. The show is important to them. They care, and they care about that, and they don't want to see a change that's beyond the pale of what they think can be assimilated. Now, that can be short-sighted too, because we've come so far. And I am very mindful of being on the other side of the fence when all the original series fans whose world was Kirk, Spock, and McCoy and Star Trek, and they saw these new actors, even though it was set very ingeniously. So thank you, Gene, and also David Gerald, and Dorothy Fontana, and everybody else there in the think tank that we talk about all the time, Bob Justman that we talk about, Susan Sackett, Richard Arnold at the time too, unofficially on the side, but in Gene's ear. We talk about the genius move to break open Next Gen so that it was not just a reboot and it wasn't a redo. It was an expansion of the universe, and nobody got it at the time. It was just, here's a safe way to have more Star Trek without insulting the old cast or putting them out to pasture prematurely and pissing off the fandom, who at the time, Star Trek fandom was 100% original series fandom, because that's all there was. Of course you didn't piss them off. It's 1986. They still had 3 movies left in them before they were put out to pasture. And even then they came back for guest star appearances. And I'm being crass here because that was the wordage used. It was a genius move at the time to avoid recasting the original roles. Well, how do we avoid that problem? We just come up with different roles, a different character set. And to create space, we're going to put ours even in the future, because it has been 20 years, and TV technology and design and cinematography and just the way we do things, the movies look so different than the TV series. And it's not just about having a movie time, pacing, structure, budget. And it took 3 seasons, Yesterday's Enterprise. And I remember thinking, oh my God, the Next Generation as a series has finally eclipsed what the movies could do, even as movies with a movie budget in a 2-hour format, not weekly episodes, but all the resources and the benefits and bonuses of a movie versus a series episode, a single episode. Even a 1-hour movie or a 2-part TV episode, if you want to have the time the same, apples to apples. No, That 1 hour episode was so amazing. Half a season before Best of Both Worlds, I was blown away by yesterday's Enterprise. And that's why it perennially stuck at the top of favorite episode and was neck and neck with Best of Both Worlds. People like, oh, Best of Both Worlds. And that's where the ratings blew up over the summer. People found it. Star Trek really took off and into the 4th and 5th season, Next Generation, I mean. But that was me. So when I hear people say, oh, you visual folks who are upset about the changes, get over it. The audiences have changed. No one's going to do something from the 60s and expect it to fly. We've talked about this before. Number one, the fact that people just care about that's half a fandom. That's why I'm here. And I'm not denigrating the amazing storytelling, the great acting. Yes, I'm talking even the original series. Because for the people who today dish the original series, go look at what else was up against it in the 60s. There's a reason classics are classics. And maybe if you're not up with it, yeah, you have to get over the context of the times. But either go back and immerse yourself in that to talk intelligently about it, or maybe not talk so much about it, aside from, well, it was the 60s. Because you really want to see the 60s, go look at some of the other tripe that came and went in the 60s that it was up against. There's a reason why Gunsmoke and Bonanza and Perry Mason and on the drama side are still around, and they're in syndication. What the streaming channels now will show those. That was not the average. If that was the average of what was on TV at any given time, you'd have 5 times more series out there. But there was so much that was tripe and trash, and people weren't set out to do that. I mean, every era, it's the same thing right now. There are series on now that no one is going to care about in 5-6 years. People got a paycheck, people did jobs, and somebody had an idea they wanted to do it well. It doesn't always happen. Something is always rising to the top. That for so many years was the original series. It gave us it's easy to say, well, it led the way to everything else. And now we don't have to look at it. Well, that's true, but maybe you should. And maybe in looking at the context of the times, you wind up growing a little bit out of your own years. And you don't, I'm saying you, maybe eventually when you add up enough of your youth years and life proceeds, you see what was the best of the eras before you. And maybe that's why it's worth keeping up with. But people are going to be emotionally invested in those years, in that look, because not just the original series, but all through the Next Generation, when you had a flashback, you had a dream, you had a holodeck, Scotty recreates that look in Relics. That's what's a bedeviling point now. You have Trials and Tribulations. They time travel and match the Enterprise. And that's 100 years later. No one bats an eye. Cisco Dax waxes on and on about the look of the equipment from that, not the props, the equipment and the gear from that era. Oh, the black with the silver accents. And then, yes, In a Mirror Darkly, we have the original, not Enterprise, but the Defiant Constitution class stuck in the alternate future with the Thode. But it's interesting to look at that time, even in 2004 and 5, and even as, yes, Enterprise was canceled midstream on that. It was an amazing show. It always brought out the people, the visitors. Tribulations had everybody coming by to visit. So, same thing happened with In a Mirror Darkly. But even then, 2 memories of that, because we were there covering it, taking pictures. Everybody had to go over and get their pictures taken. And yeah, you can find the pictures. David Goodman, you can find the pictures with Terry Metalis when he was Brandon's assistant. Everyone going over to take their pictures, get their selfies. And before we talked about the word selfie. But even then, Herman Zimmerman, production designer, all the staff, Mike, everybody, Doug, everybody who was on the show, there were tweaks. The red railings were rounded, not perfectly butted 2x4s. There was slight, even then they realized that the look was looking dated. And the 4th season of Enterprise was HD. There were slight motions in the big overhead poster view screens. There were tweaks that they made to try to ease it into, 30 years later's view, 40 years later's viewing. And even 10 years almost since it had been done for Tribulations. There'd been the revolution in HD TV by then. We were on the cusp of streaming. Not that that affects the visual look. But they were cognizant that things needed to be updated a little bit. Tribulations did pioneer the idea that if things were less sophisticated models, sets, it's because we didn't have cameras on them. So when Greg Jean, late great Greg Jean, out of his own pocket, way over provided for what he was paid for, a half size of the Smithsonian now, the 11-foot original, built an all new Enterprise and a not digital model with internal lights and the whole bit. Gary Hutzel, the whole visual effects, everybody helping out with that. Spinning lights and the nacelle caps and the Bassard collectors, all of that. And a K7 that we could actually see detail on. And a Klingon D7 that we could see, which wasn't even used in the original Tribbles episode. And pushing in on them to get level of detail for 1996 audiences with the caveat that, well, we never saw a D7, a Klingon battle cruiser, in Tribbles. They didn't even try to have one. They blew the wad on the station, and we never got close to the station. We're only now getting close to see the detail. The model didn't have the detail in 1967. This model did, but that was the caveat. That was the retcon of explaining it to make it more palatable to a 1996 audience, but to cover that. That's what you do, because the cover already was that. The consoles were so powerful, they were reprogrammable. No, there were no labels on the buttons. That's what Lost in Space would have done with a million blinkies that look like they're right out of mid-60s NASA that now look so dated. The models that look so smooth-sided, and Star Wars ruined us all for having greeblies and having all that texture to convey a small model looking really bigger than it was. Why did the simple models of original series in the 60s look so simple? Well, they were cheaper. They didn't have the money to do all that detailing. But what do we retcon for years and years? They were so powerful. They did, and the Federation was the force that it was. And yeah, the Klingon ships were more angular. Every alien race culture since then has been more angular than rounded. Round is good and maternal and organic, and angle and sharpie is scary and creepy and evil. And I'm broad brushing here, but that's the deal. And you could do that because, sure, they were powerful. Federation Starfleet ships were powerful, but they didn't have to show it. It was all under the panels, the hallway. Now, if you popped off a panel and spent $4,000 under there one episode, you want to get into all the gouda. And the original series too, with the original pioneering piped, in the 60s circuit boards glued down. Miss Uhura, I can think of no one better suited to handle this board. Thank you, sir. I mean, they would occasionally try to replicate that. Same thing in the 80s and the 90s, Next Gen and the other shows, when you had to pull off a panel, a Mies panel, and get into it. That was going to be bucks, but it was there. But the overall design aesthetic was, we don't have to show internals or externals. Okay, but sure, when you get close enough up, there are panels on the original Enterprise hull. Okay. All that to say, that's what made the shows for those people. I never denigrated. And I think most people, most canonistas, as opposed to Leonard's quote, some people are going to do that, but some people will do that with anything. They'll do it with sports trivia. They'll do it with whatever. They will take their knowledge and bash people over the head with it who don't know. You can't stop that. It's always going to infect from other things in their life, are going to affect what is personal to them, and they will take whatever means a lot to them and use that as a cudgel. It could be this, it could be basket weaving, it could be quilt making, it could be stamp collecting, it could be whatever. That's going to happen. From my experience, most of the people who are canonistas or canon smoothers and gap fillers who just go, ooh, and whether they're technically, whether they're ship pornistas or whether they're cosplayers, or whether the details is what they love. And not just the fact that they're anal detailists, but the fact that Star Trek cared enough to make you care. And that goes back to Gene and Dorothy and Bob. And the old thing about science fiction is looked upon askance right now as not serious. So we have to overcome the serious divide and make this as real as we can, and make these people on this ship in the future as real as we can. And of course, they're 20th century people reflecting us, elevated. But we're going to blow ourselves up. We're going to destroy our own platform if we are silly with our week-to-week continuity. And as a kid, the amazing thing wasn't that I sat there and went, ooh, phasers. The fact that the phaser was pretty much the same week to week to week to week to week. And the door out of the bridge was the same week to week to week. I didn't think of all this at the time. Not until you read the making of not in the making of Star Trek, which is why it was so revolutionary too. You got sucked into the adventures and the meanings and the messages and the morals. And and it was well acted for the most part. You are sucked in on a surface level as a kid, as a first-time viewer. But the more you watch, the more you realize what was going on below the surface. And then you realize what was designed that wasn't part of the week's needs. The pre-planning included aspects that were not needed week to week in the story. They might never have come up in a story. You might never have known about anything until you heard someone interviewed and mentions this, or you see their memos, or you see their drawings, and you went, oh my God, they did this and never even used it. But that's a symbol of how much went into the show. And that is what the Canonistas respond to. And that's why that's why I've tried to bring every background creator out, because their work a lot of times never shows up. It never gets talked about. And part of it's because people don't know to ask until you get to the original paper, drawings, memos, whatever. And that's all a thing. So if people want to bash on the Canonistas, then you're taking away my childhood. And you're taking away that for a lot of people. They're into the show. And that doesn't mean that we're blind to the good that Star Trek meant to other people. It just meant that was our entry point, and we all have that. And that's the diversity of fandom. And don't you dare gatekeep on me. But at the same time, I understand the frustration of people who that's not their favorite. And to them, this all looks very shallow. And it's really unfortunate that the way things have evolved, number one, time goes by. We keep educating. I try to bring the context. I try to bring the receipts and the living history. Here's the letters. Here's the memos. Here's what people wrote in Starlog and Interstat, where they bash Next Generation. The holy cast of Next Generation, how could that happen? It's perspective, it's time, it's where people are. You're leaving this paradigm to go to this one, and the years go by. And eventually it becomes not a moving fact of life, but a curiosity. Did you know that people used to refuse to watch The Next Generation because they thought it was erasing Kirk, Spock, and McCoy? People refused to watch The Next Generation if they'd been huge fans of the original because they thought they were just slapping Star Trek on something and expecting us to watch it. Yes, nothing new is under the sun. That was all there. I'm just saying. So, even when you see a quote from Nimoy, let's put it in context and realize that that's okay. Okay. And there is a thing as reverse gatekeeping. There's probably such a thing as reverse racism in limited situations. I'm not trying to equate these two things. I'm just saying that when people are passionate about the thing they love, and they're all supposed to be on the same page, the same franchise IP, and yet they have different favorite aspects, that should be something to celebrate. Boy, if ever there was a time for IDIC, that would be it. Instead of dividing and conquering and all that. There's enough of that going on in the world, much less within fandom. And that's what I wanted to get to here. The amazing thing about Star Trek is that it appealed to so many people on so many. Marshak and Lichtenfield's book, Star Trek talked about all these effects, the tailored effects, and how there were 6 or 8 different things that appealed to different aspects and wound up creating this huge audience with all these different threads that people could grab onto, or maybe more than one. Very few people, maybe all of them, but everybody had one major buy-in, attractant magnet to Star Trek. They called them the tailored effects, and each chapter was about all of that. But I think what makes Star Trek different than everything else, and here's where we get into the modern world, because at the time, I didn't think that. And Star Wars was, well, this is fun. It's exciting. It's a great movie, but it'll never replace Star Trek because there's so much in Star Trek, and Star Wars And it wasn't a competition. I wasn't keeping score. I just knew what was stacked with more depth and what wasn't. One was flashier and newer. And the minute Star Trek got a chance to have a movie, they'd catch up on those easy aspects. And we don't know how that's all played out. Star Trek just lost out on not having the coolest toys that would sit in your closet for 30 years and be passed down to your kids and create a much bigger fandom in the end. But to Leonard's quote, most canonistas I know do not bash everybody else over there with their knowledge. They don't make themselves, it's just the opposite. They want to share. They can't stop talking about it. They want everybody to know. They want to pull out the cool and the this and then that. Whether they're doing a CG model or an analog model, or they're doing a cosplay, they're building props, whatever they're doing, they want to share it. And I think underneath all of this is, for me, as the years go, we didn't think about all these. We didn't think about labels and buzzwords and categories and boxes. You just did it. And it's only been the last 10, 15 years when we had no Star Trek when it came back. There was the conflict again. First thing I thought of was the goofy times, people bashing Star Trek 2 but for killing Spock off and running that marketing survey that said you will lose X, the consumer militarism as a way to direct the flow of the movie. And even though you might say, well, it's protests and it can be negative, it did open eyeballs. It did get people to consider other aspects. Money talks in a lot of ways, but just sometimes the human reaction, even if something was going to go different, even if it doesn't go 180, it might veer off and go 90. And it's good. Audience reaction is good. Sometimes the audience reaction is so all over the board, you can't learn anything from it. But sometimes that does happen. The folks that want to share, the folks who relish and revel and love Star Trek's background, and it makes them think what we aren't seeing, and it makes them project just as much as a science consultant is trying to project and talk about a phaser or a deflector shield or programmable matter. Whatever that future projection would be, people are engaged, and some people's bit is projecting out on their own for what the show hasn't even gotten to. And just as much as a lot of people clung to the plots and the characters and the camaraderie and the chemistry, so many C words in Star Trek, and that was what was more important to them, not the visuals. For a lot of people, the human continuity and the visual continuity had the same effect in that you could depend on Star Trek. In a crazy world where things shift, politics, religion, your sports heroes might even give up on you. But you could depend on Star Trek, and that is partly why the characters create a sensation. If something is perceived, if you're going to kill off Spock, if you're going to do this, that, the other. Who wants to see Picard as an old man captain? That hurt a lot of people's sensibility, even though they apparently missed Wolverine. I think Picard did it better than Wolverine. People, it's not so much that they're against change, it's that they can depend on Star Trek to not be insane. They can depend on Star Trek not to be all over the board. They can depend on Star Trek not to let them down. And when it does, or they perceive it to be, they are hurt. And if you want to say, well, that's not a healthy thing to be that may be what some people, and look at Susan Sackett's Letters to Star Trek book in the 70s, talked about people medically, mental health wise, survival in the middle of the jungles against the Viet Cong and the Vietnam War. The universality and survival and dependability of Star Trek has meant so much in so many different ways to so many people. So when you take somebody's dependability, and whether it's passion, recreation, or it's more than that, and who's to judge in a case-by-case basis if that's healthy or not? Sometimes it's all people have at a certain point in their life. And you're always reading about those people and people giving their testimonial. Now, is that, and we all go, oh, that's amazing. Thank goodness that had that, right? Jimmy Doohan used to talk the story about the girl near suicide, and Scotty saved her, and she wrote to him back, right? And he stayed up with her famously for years and years after that. That's a wonderful story, and that's replicated with all the casts and all the generations now. It's just the original series cast had 20 years themselves when this was new and fresh, and even to some eyes weird and strange. But now we know what pop culture is, and so much of the rest of life isn't dependable. And it has let people down, and people can lean on their pop culture heroes. And they do sound off when they perceive they've been slighted or altered in a way that's not comfortable and letting them down. And sometimes change comes just from people not being aware of this or different weights given. And yes, the modern era, I felt let down by the visual choices. The problem is I understand what's going on. It's everybody wants to be creative. Everybody wants to live in the now. Everyone wants to live in the moment and show off. They want to win awards. They want to do this. And most of them are aware. They don't want to be the one to mess up Star Trek. They don't want to be the one to be ballyhooed and hooted at. But they're not always aware. And we all know the mix of creatives working on these shows. Sometimes they're huge fans. Sometimes they don't know anything. And sometimes they know, but they don't know as much as they might know. And the more intelligent ones grab people in the room. You heard Carlos Cisco talk about on Seventh Rule. If you didn't, go listen to that this week in The Breen, talking about how, no, he was not a fan. He knew everybody, it works in media, knows Star Trek is out there. And now, as opposed to 30 years ago, they know it's a huge money-making franchise and that it's affected things. And people now know that if you work on Star Trek, even if you're not making a living from it, 40 and 50 years from now, two things. One, your work will still be scrutinized, so don't F it up, at least to your ability. And B, you will probably still be talking about the Star Trek you did when you're 20s, you'll probably in your 60s and 70s and still talking about it. So that's that side of the fence. It's just like, in general, the old phrase, nobody sets out to make a bad movie or make a bad TV show. People all want to do their best. Sometimes it's just their awareness and their guidance. And I know out of the gate with Discovery, there was a dual emphasis of let's make things better, change it. Here's what I've always wanted to do differently. A lot of that was Brian's thinking. And a lot of it was the more attention by more people. They say canon, they're talking about concept canon. That's why people were attacking making Michael the unknown foster sister of Spock, not sister, foster sister. Well, Sybok was a half brother that people, a certain section of fandom, were pissed about in 1990, which led to the denigration of Star Trek V on top of everything else. But it's not exactly precedent. It's happened before. And the extreme surgical precision care of inserting Michael into the Sarek family, and then eventually how it all wound up reflecting back on Sarek and Amanda, and whoa, it explains so much. The best part of early Discovery to me was the not rebooting Sarek and Amanda and the Spock family, but just totally adding the way you would want new layers of texture, that whole aspect. Now, and I know I've been all over the place today, but I'm trying to wrap my arms around all of this. The other thing that's wacky about this is there is a two-sided bit. There are the people that will never, ever forgive Kurtzman era Trek, the redo of the original series Enterprise Bridge. I was taken aback. I knew in my head I had to find a way around it. And that will be a fight that may go on forever. It all came back in with the Breen, with the ISS. The fact that this is a ship 800 years in the future, the fact that it was the Mirror Universe Enterprise, the fact that it had been taken over by rebels who even took over and moved in with not technological bits. They were rebel refugees to get away from the Mirror and try to cross the universal gap, which is amazing to me. Talk about refugees crossing the Mediterranean to get to Europe. Here's people trying to cross the quantum divide to get away. And lots of things could have happened to that ship in 800 years. That wasn't the problem. But basically, the trigger was there, and people came out. And it was another reason to... And am I disappointed that the Discovery and Strange New Worlds Enterprise doesn't fit closer to the 60s bridge? Of course I am. Am I stupid and I don't know that 2017 audiences won't accept what a 1960? I do. I've said this before. If I had been in charge, I would have seen that as a false choice. Hey, kids, is it a dessert topping? Is it a floor wax? Hey, it's both. If you like your Saturday Night Live old classic commercials, it can be both, because I said forever, design is different than cinematography. And that's what I thought In a Mere Darkness was starting to show. You can make tweaks, but it's how you film it, light it, edit it, pace it. And the old go-to example, as we said many times, is we will always do World War II movies. But the moment a producer decides that the tanks, the logos on the tanks should be modernized, made more, the minute that somebody decides that German helmet look, we can improve on that. The minute you start changing history, then you're, whatever decade some decades, you had clean-shaven soldiers out in the field. I used to hoot at that if it was low budget. Then in the 70s, everything got gritty and sweaty. And if somebody was dirty, there wasn't just a little smack of dirt on their face. Oh, look, he's been out in the dirt. He must be a soldier in the trenches. No, things got so raunchy, dirty, sweaty in the 70s. It's like they rebelled out of the studio system and had sweaty, dirty, hunky, bloody, gory effects for war movies. The different eras of production look and sound differently, but no one changed the logo, the white cross on the star on an American tank, or the cross on a German tank, or the difference between American and German helmets. Nobody changed that. It's how it was. That's what could have been the answer for Star Trek. We've retconned reprogrammable buttons. We could have seen that in action. We could have seen not plywood sharp corners. We could have seen rounded edges. We could have seen a variety of materials, much less the lighting and all of that. All could have been done. But here's the biggest point of all. It wasn't. And, no pun intended here, but kids, that ship has sailed. We're beyond that. So you're left with 2 or 3 choices. Yes, it pained me not to go there. Yes, I preach texture, not trivia. That's what we're left with now. So either the easiest thing to say is, oh, it's a different universe and a different timeline. Well, maybe 20 and 30 and 40 years from now, maybe that's what the ultimate decision is made to be. Maybe we've got a third timeline here, and the people who are screaming for that, maybe that eventually becomes what they want. Or my first go-to was that the 60s, the preponderance, the move, the flow, the years are going to be in favor of the way things now. And the more time goes by, the more the actual pristine 60s episodes are going to be the anomaly. And you'll still have to explain why relics and especially why tribulations and In a Mere Darkly. My temporary retcon was those are the fictional adventure versions that Kirk talks about in his foreword to the novelization that Gene, it was cute at the time that Kirk talks about the dramatized adventures of his crew may have affected public, like the dime novels glorified all the Wild West heroes and villains and made legends of all these guys. Bat Masterson and Billy the Kid and on down and on down and on down. Doc Holliday and the gunfight at the OK Corral, all of that. Like, what was the truth and what was real about all these glorified people? It was the subject matter of the short-lived TV show Legend that Michael Piller tried to create and only ran 13 episodes, sadly. You could have the 23rd century version of that, and that would explain the 60s decor. And in reality, this is because that was that was their equivalent of a budget of limited means. That was something easy to hang your hat on. Or now we've got this rolling effect of all the temporal incursions, starting with transparent aluminum and the whales and going forward. I don't know that Naked Time did that much. And Cinemagia Forever seems to have actually been a button up. But we've had enough incursions back and forth that now Akiva Goldsman, some of the rest are talking about, Terry, we're talking about how the ripples in time are going to be affected as we go back. Time travel affects loops, and now we as an audience come to see things, and things are different. That the technology wave arrives faster, that the eugenics wars aren't after years of doing it, the eugenics wars have been pushed back. World War III is pushed back because we are literally leaning into that. And that's the other thing. We knew that was going to happen eventually. Kids, the big thing is going to be in 30, 40, 50 years when we actually develop a faster than light drive, the Q-Bear engine, whatever. And it has nothing to do with some lattice crystalline element called dilithium. It's like, what is that? When we have hyperlight drive, fastest speed of light, however it's computed and scored and however it's created, it will have nothing to do with our Canon, carefully constructed after all the decades, way of warp drive. Maybe it'll involve some kind of a subspace bubble. I dare say that unless we really do discover dilithium on the 5th moon of Jupiter. But, Zephram Cochrane made his Warp 1 flight without dilithium. But at that point, it will be like game over, because that's like the core tenet of all Star Trek, right? Even the burn will be like, well, then what blew up in the burn? What did that alien kid scream about? Wasn't dilithium. I mean, everything top to bottom. So you can wait for the Vulcans to get here. I'm waiting for warp drive to get invented, because maybe then emotionally we turn the corner on Star Trek and this attachment to it. Because here's the other thing. When people rise up to talk about that, and I'm not talking about the hateful, stupid, uncivil, crude, crass, hammer throwing, bashing defense of this false choice. The false choice that we should have had both. The ship has sailed. Let's come up with a reason why and move on. And it may be that the temporal that they're all correct. Everything is good, but the way it is because we're looking at version 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to say that's inevitable, because inevitably we're going to have warp drive without dilithium. Just to say one thing. Just to go for one example. That will be sad. But it's the kind of thing that, okay, when people bash this desire to change and alter and come up with a reason, that gets the people that could always depend on Star Trek are going to be disappointed. But here's the other thing. We have lived through this before, too, because somebody asked me this in the magazine column, Fistful of Dollars, in your Star Trek Explorer magazine. Get yours today, and yes, you can get a digital edition if you don't want paper. Someone said, when the Klingons were changed for the motion picture, because everybody knew they had budget and they wanted to be more alien, and Gene got to do the design choices he really wanted to do all along but couldn't because of money and time, was there an uproar in fandom? And searching my mind, I want to say no. People were saying, well, of course, people got it. Of course, this is more money. Movie time and scale and pace and budget can allow them to be not glorified Fu Manchus and Ming the Merciless, right? And not wearing uniforms and things that just accented their human actorness underneath with a black undershirt and a gold jerkin. We were conscious of it, but we didn't fight it. But the more the years went by, concerned, curious people wanted to know. Choosy mothers wanted to know, why is the difference? What is the difference? It's Star Trek. There must be a difference. They stuck to themselves. It was an enclave. The outside world didn't go, that's a stupid thing to worry about. Just enjoy the story. Nobody even knew this was a question for years. And I answered the question by showing the original FASA. They came up with the first retcon of what was going on. They said that the humans we saw in the original series were a human-Klingon fusion that the Klingons came up with to be on the front line of their human interface. So they wouldn't look too scary, but that they were struggling, flailing to get an answer. And if you played those games at the time, you know all about the Klingon Imperial and the Klingon fusion. The actual Klingons look like our revolution. And all the Kling, I mean, there's different head skulls and all of that. And the weird thing about L'Orelle's head changing, maybe she had cosmetic surgery. I know, I get that as they evolved, and that whole political thing about the Klingons, and then they course corrected, and then people were mad because of the course correction. We can at least say species diversity. At least those aren't, aside from L'Orelle and a few others. And DS9 already coming up with updating, Kang, Koloth, and Kor, and people getting over that. But still, the Uber fans on staff, when it came time for Tribulations, Ron and Renee, Ron D. Moore, Renee Echeverria, wanted to address, because you had Worf, and you had to match film from the Tribble. That came up. And they wanted to explain the thing for real. They realized it was going to get convoluted, and it was way too much to bog down the rest of the story that we all know, which was great. You couldn't insert into that in a line or two. So they throw in the joke line, which in many ways made it worse because now it was on the radar screen. You couldn't blow it off. It's just a production thing. Ignore it. Get over it. You anal background fans, you. So now it had to be addressed. And then it fell to the next time a huge anal fanboy and number 2 and number 3 were running a show when Manny Cotto got the key. The late, great Manny Cotto got the keys. Mike Sussman, the rest of the staff said, okay, here is our chance as the clock ticks down on people having Star Trek keys for a while, knowing they were canceled. Let's finally fix this. And it was convoluted, but it makes sense. And you know what? The longer we've been dealing with it, the more we're comfortable with it. And you know what? They even made the augment and tied into the Soongs and set up, for better or for worse, all the Soong storylines, the Soong family as a concept, with Brent having employment for life, apparently, and the whole lineage of the Soong family and their travails into AI and to android building and eugenics and changing course out of that. All of that got set up by this thing that grew out of people wanting to talk about the Klingon augment, coming up with the Klingon augment virus as a way to explain the thing. So for 30 years, a big chunk of the world had said, oh, it's not worth messing with. Just move on. It was a production change, bigger budget. Of course, we all know what it was. But the canonistas among us, including the pro ranks, came up with that. And look what it all yielded. Texture, not trivia. You take the weird thing and then suddenly it is not weird. You explain why it's an oddity. Maybe it's not. As far as I know, every single aspect of 300 years of Star Trek history in real life has not been on film, and we are not exposed to it yet. So there's plenty of open corridors to that. So back to my point here. The people rising up again who are pissed that the designs were changed. And then the segment of fandom who's making fun of them, saying, sit down, shut up, go back to your corner. Why do you care about this? Move on. No one wants to see a 60s design in 2017. Those are all false choices. They didn't have to be made. But the ship has sailed. They have been. Something eventually will come up to talk about it. So number one, we are not going to, as long as we are human and we are civil, we're not going to denigrate anybody's viewpoint on their favorite. We're not going to forget that when people's favorites are messed with, they get emotional and passionate about it. We want to remind people when they're in the middle of being emotional and passionate that they owe people some respect about it if they get mutual respect back. And number two, nothing is set in stone. And all the people that made fun of people wanting to come up with a Klingon makeup change reason, eventually it happened. And it's begat all this other texture to play with. That's what happens when you have the luxury of a 60-year-old and counting franchise. You're going to have eras and pendulum swings and different attitudes, and you're going to have different people running the shows. And you're going to have different people at the top with the hands-on people below them. And right now, we're in the middle of a timey-wimey wobbly thing here, not just about how the Enterprise bridge looks and doesn't, but what is the nature of this temporal wave going through? What's going to happen? My initial disappointment right now is that if we're going to depend on the biggest downside of the temporal incursions making things unchanged is that whole you can always depend on Star Trek, that's gone. That makes me easy queasy, and I wonder if I will care. And I wonder if hundreds of thousands of other people will care if you if you unmoor Star Trek from its underpinnings and go there. Now, maybe this gets delved into and refined and treated enough to where it becomes a powerful storytelling tool, a powerful grounding. And just like when we see with Shattered, or we see with Face the Strange, we know well enough that people use those. It's the Spider-Verse across the universe. If you go from the fact that you rebooted 3 times with 3 different actors playing Spider-Man to the point where you are so comfortable with it that you use it, maybe we get back to that. Maybe that becomes, and I'm not saying that we wound up with the different quantum universes, that 60s Trek is in one prime timeline and there's prime 2 that is now. That may not necessarily be the place to go, but some way, enough time goes by, enough comfort zone, and here's the thing, enough change or evolution in those in charge with the keys happens that eventually something is invented to come up with the reason why. But I'll tell you right now, my first reaction is if we resort to the temporality, the incursions having changed things from what we knew before, and we're just looking at different, then that's disappointing because now Star Trek is not grounded. I can't depend on the Star Trek that I knew. And yes, of course, there'll be aspirational, wonderful stories championing diversity. And all the people who look to Star Trek for that will still get that. But the underpinning for the fandom won't be there. And in the big picture, and this is something that I've had to come up with the last 10 years or so, as the MCU, as all things comic books became huge with Hollywood getting involved, as Star Wars got bigger and bigger and finally figured out that they really wanted to have series, that's one way to expand their universe. They just need to have more than one hit series for that. Of course, the Uber fans are going to love all of these. As those other franchises got huge, as Harry Potter huge and blew up and then shrank and maybe come back. Anyways, all these other franchises are out there competing with Star Trek that, aside from Doctor Who, yes, although Star Trek showed Doctor Who out of market, nobody can even compare to Star Trek, maybe aside from Doctor Who, as far as longevity and as far as impact in the world. Star Trek, as we know, helped George get over his funding fence and get the original Star Wars made. Why Star Trek? The one thing that sets it apart from all these amazing, exciting franchises, IPs that make millions of people want to be so invested. And why Star Trek was drifting away and it's come back and it could never drift away totally. It just needed people to wake up, its handlers to wake up and do it right. Star Trek is the one that has always tried to be grounded. Star Trek is the one that didn't reboot every 2 years. Star Trek is the one that hasn't had 18 Batmobiles. And that's fine for everybody else. Star Trek, that was the most unique thing about Star Trek. That and its science grounding. And yes, Doctor Who, again, accidentally, again. How do you deal with the real life recast? You create the whole background DNA of the Doctor regenerates. So now, Doctor Who is the franchise best equipped to be around for thousands of years. You just keep, and I know, and we went through the limit, was it 13? They've retconned around that, which was making people mad at the time. Okay, but did you really? If you didn't, then your alternative was to never have more. Oh, we've gone through 13, yay. Be like Ding-a-ling and his 10 movies, and now he can't decide on the 10th movie, and he'll decide on his 10th movie for the next 40 years. Is that going to be the artificial limit, the false choice? The thing to look forward to for the future. The pendulum's going to swing. Different people are going to be in charge. At some time down the line, someone will say, yes, it's time to explain the Klingon makeup. Yes, it's time to explain the different Klingon Enterprise bridges by this method or the other. And maybe we don't keep using temporal wave incursions from time travel as our wobbly reason, but we come up with an overarching framework to support it. I hope I live long enough to see that. Because right now, when I hear that excuse, I want to say, well, what's the big game plan? And of course, there isn't one as far as I can tell. That's why I'm so itchy to see what we're doing here. Because if the thing is just to kick the eugenics wars, can and the World War III can down the road, are we going to put off first contact with the Vulcans? Is that going to eventually, when we get closer to the real, 2061, are we going to kick that can down the road too when there aren't Vulcans showing up on April 4th and 5th, 21? Because it will happen. And we can't do, that's the 90s passed, and Greg Cox madly retconned the eugenics wars into being the underground war the rest of us didn't really know about. And okay, I think half the world didn't even know that was out there. It's just maybe a matter of time, because that's one thing that is no one's fault. We are kids. The Bell riots are in what, 4 months? Are we going to temporarily excuse the Bell riots not happening the first 4 days of September this year? We can talk about how prescient they were, but what's going to happen there? In the end, this may be the best answer, best excuse there is. But right now, it's not just timey-wimey. It's wibbly-wobbly. We don't have anything to ground anything to. And it's just a free-for-all turkey shoot. Whatever you want to have happen, whatever you need to have happen, just say, oh, temporal. It was a temporal incursion change. We need the big picture. But that may not be available for a while. And we may have ups and down times. The streaming, I don't think with the money attached to Star Trek that we should be 12 years without ongoing product. But humans can be really, humans and media and capitalism, as we saw last summer, cannot be exactly, as the Vulcans would say, logical about anything. And a moneymaker like Star Trek, assuming you're doing it right, would always be fulfilling the coffers of its corporate owners. It should be a win-win for both sides. And the more money they make will be if they put more care, attention, and put the right people making it. That should be a thing. But look, guys, this design argument and the put down, it's a false choice. It will get taken care of. It's going to go away. We've been there already. And some of us have been doing this canon smoothing and gap filling since, I don't know, a few decades now, as I say on Second Opinion. So let's take it easy on each other. Let's realize that people, if they didn't care, they wouldn't be here, and none of us would be here because no one would have cared about Star Trek. And that there are many appeals of the show. If visual canon wasn't part in continuity, wasn't part of Star Trek would be just out there with all the other franchises. And maybe it would be just as big. Maybe it would have the niche it has. Would it have been the spark plug for so much else back in the day? I don't know. But these are some dots that in this big picture fight, when it comes down to two people bashing each other in a comment thread, I want to go, look, guys, here are the shockwaves. Here's the implications. Here's the meta of what we should think about. And if you're upset about the choices made, I'm upset that no one looked at the beginning and said, the challenge is to do the 60s in a competitive, exciting, creative way now. You don't run away from it. That's your creative challenge. And you'll be so awesome if you can pull it off. And I'm not talking here most recently about the incredible recreation of the TNG bridge for season 3 in Picard. Dave and Liz and a whole amazing staff, all the Gold Star, Gold Era veterans working on it. That's getting the German helmets and the American white stars on the tanks, the Sherman tanks, correct. That's the basic. I'm talking about updating the Titan, updating the looks of the sets to be 20, 30 years later. I'm talking about those choices that had to be made. And some people, the carpet versus vinyl isn't going to go away. And this thing about updating the 60s to the 80s, look, all those shows shoot with the crane. I laugh. I critique all these bridges for being bus station bridges. They're huge. They're huge. Somebody walks from the captain's chair down to the front helm or to one of the back stations. It takes 5 minutes. I'm exaggerating, but it feels like it. It's not 2 steps down to a thing. They have to take several steps to get anywhere. Why? People have finally told me. They love with the cranes they can do and those drone type, scoopy shots. But those cranes take room and things have to be spaced out. That's a perfect example of that's bringing more storytelling power, but it's going to affect the actual physical layout of the bridge. So if someone actually did a picture perfect an Enterprise D level recreation back, but it had the Kirk, Sulu, Chekhov, Outer Ring, McCoy, Scotty, Spock, Uhura ring spread out a little more. If things were fudged, if there were more wild sections, that's the kind of thing I would say, okay. And that's what's reflected in the Enterprise bridges we wound up with. And you'll notice that the original debut of the Enterprise on Discovery is more out there. It was pulled back in so many ways for Strange New. So there's that. But it's all about what was the marching orders, what's the actual challenge delivered, thrown down. What's the goal? What's the mission statement? And that was not the height of priority at the time. Do I wish it was? Yes. The ship has sailed. We need to move on. We need to come up with the next level phase, which is quit arguing about the smooth heads and the bumpy heads and figure out the meta reason for all this. And it is not being weird and picayune and a waste of time and anal canonista background people that don't care about the wonderfulness of all the rest of Star Trek. It is Star Trek for them. And some people, you get my point. You get my point. We don't need to be fighting over it because it's all going to take care of itself. And some of the answers are going to percolate up from fandom itself. And some of it may be from licensees. And some of it may be from licensees, gaming, designs, magazines, publishing, who have fans who have bubbled up to add to that. That's where we are. People who depend on Star Trek to be their rock in the middle of chaos, whether that's emotionally or just as a home in all the ways, because they take that stability as a sign of its future, that it's going to be around in a few years, that it's worth investing their time in. How many times have you been pissed that the show you got so into was canceled after a season or two? To the point now where you won't watch, my wife will not watch a show until it's been out. She thinks she's going to enjoy it. She won't watch it until there are 2 seasons out because she doesn't want to be ripped up at the end. And that sounds ridiculous until you remember how much big TV we've had recently. There are series sitting around on shelves that that a fraction of the audience has been able to see just because there was so much. So the last few years, it's a winning strategy. You want to protect your own emotional involvement. It's not about having your feelings hurt. It's about, I invested that time in an increasingly crazy world where we have so many choices, especially if we're looking to what we get out of Star Trek that we've gotten out of here. If Star Trek, as the first, and if not the biggest, the most long-lasting, for a reason, for still having uniqueness among a world where we are Comic-Con to death with so many IPs and franchises and media and formats. If that ultimately, it shouldn't go away, much less be denigrated. It is important. It deserves to be one of the 5 C's of Star Trek, as I say in one of my talks. And I'm talking about the C word, canon, or continuity, how you prefer. That is what made Star Trek, as much as the commentary, as much as the characters, as much as the casting. And if we look at the series over the years, different series, if one has been more or less popular or impactful, maybe it's because one of those C's suffered. And here's the last thing I want to say. This really hit home to me because I saw news of a poll. And okay, yes, yet another poll, la-di-da. So I filmed the news website, media, sci-fi, fantasy genre. I filmed was citing a poll by SurveyMonkey. Now, SurveyMonkey is a survey, random thing, generic, people use it, right? SurveyMonkey ran a very generic poll. In fact, they even said 579. This is from February 22. It got on my radar. And the reason I cite this is because I also saw recently, and still going, a Popverse poll that's open right now. You can get, if you went to Popverse and looked at Star Trek favorite or whatever, they're running a basic thing about what is your favorite series? Just bing, bing, bing. At the time an article was written about it, it was 1,300 votes. It's now up to 4,770. There's no running total, unfortunately, but there was a news story written on their own site when the vote total was 1,300, or it's already more than tripled. And at the time, that poll with no numbers attached that they just said in first place by a long shot was DS9. And some of you say, well, yeah, it's the, I know. I'm just saying DS9, then Voyager. They don't say anybody else's ranking. They just mention that they are surprisingly ahead of TNG. Well, I don't think that's a surprise anymore, but if there's a lot of gap, maybe. Everybody else is below that, talking about not only Prodigy and Lower Decks and Picard, and this is current, but the original series and Discovery. That's a current poll, and you can go vote over there. 2 years ago, February 2022, the SurveyMonkey poll was done. It was only 570. So part of this is the poll size, and where does the poll appear? Is the audience already skewed who sees the poll, right? Is it scientifically carried out with all the things that supposedly polls or the political and other marketing polls are done? No. So 2 years ago in this random poll, the original series was still on top with 34%. Then Next Generation 19%, DS9 at 11%, Enterprise at 10%, Voyager at 8%, then Discovery at 7%, then Picard before season 3, Picard at 4%, Lower Decks at, Prodigy at 3.5%, and basically Lower Decks at barely 1%. So right there, only random 500. Really? Original series still in first? Then TNG, then DS9, then Enterprise, and then all that above Voyager with the Janeway's army that's come along. Prodigy ahead of Lower Decks. And I'm not judging either shows. That does not compute with what I'm thinking. Now, Prodigy was early, Lower Decks was early. That was 2 years ago. That could account with it. And the new series all getting tiny numbers compared to the older ones. Part of what I'm saying about the emotion behind the reaction, and this is the last part of this puzzle, all these dots I'm trying to connect today in a long show, I know, is what I mentioned before. Time is passing. That means different people will have the keys, different people will be in charge of the franchise, different people will be in charge of bringing those to light as executive producers. There will be different production designers, different prop people, different visual effects people, and different writers in the writing room. The actors playing roles, that's the bottom rung of the ladder. the bare bones of the keel of these shows being laid down in the dry dock, that's where it all starts. And yeah, that's what Portal 47 is about. But go ahead, keep enjoying the cherry on top of your favorite actors doing your favorite roles so brilliantly. I guess that's allowed too. But I'm just saying, all of those initial points, the actors are like the last thing to come along in that process. And all of that will keep evolving and changing over time too. And just as only 10 years ago, these results would have been shocking. The original series forever over next gen, and people were still not respecting DS. It took the revolution of Netflix and binging for DS9, and then that generation who were inspired by Kate Mulgrew and Voyager, that generation of women, and Seven, and B'Elanna, to grow up and mature and speak their truth and jump up for that. Time is everything. And if anything happens, back to our original Enterprise design, if any of that noise finally goes away, I don't know if it will be because of any logic I've tried to bring to the situation today. It may just be because the original series generation finally leaves us. It's because the demographic wave, as these polls are kind of groping their way to, unscientific as they are, but it's happening. It's already happening with the original series giving way to even its partners at the time, DS9 and Voyager. If you've ever seen me live at a convention, I try to always, whether it's a solo panel or I'm even on a panel and we have time, we're not like crammed into 30 minutes, try to just get a handle, the sense of in the room. And of course, the room is a self-selected set. The room is fandom who got themselves to a convention and had the money to get there. Pay the tickets, pay the hotel, the travel, whatever, it was out of town. And I talk about that. When you're online is not all fandom. Online are the people who are online that they can afford to spend some amount of time in a day here. Convention fandom, which used to be thought of as the hardcore, well, not always. There's a lot of opinion and emotion and representation of people who never get to show up at a convention, or people who would love to be online all day or half a day or even an hour or two a day who can't be. So everything has to be looked at through those filters. But one thing we know is the clock is ticking. And despite the people like the young entrepreneur that I found at Star Trek San Francisco, you find her on my channel, who's making Etsy buttons and earrings and things, who says, after watching everything from her fandom parents, but totally on her own decision making, the original series is her favorite, and she's 11 because it's about the stories and the characters and not about action and sci-fi visual effects. She sounds like the brochure for the most beginners of the excesses of the current age. She sounds like the brochure for the biggest original series, board out there. But that was her take. So who knows what will happen as the years go by. But the basic demo curve is going to be so that maybe the debate over this whole issue of what to do about the convergent looks, maybe it only becomes the realm of the purist, and the folks who actually grew up with that bridge and that look eventually leave us. And just the pure numbers of things don't notice it so much. And maybe it becomes not a hot issue. Again, only over the purists and the historians and the academics and the people who watched and fought for a third season and the people who made the syndication numbers explode, not because they were on a mission or a quest, but because that's what they wanted to do with their life because Star Trek was so awesome. And still 10 years later, nothing like anything on TV, watching after school or at the dinner time news hour. They'll all be gone finally. And just as we said goodbye to John Trimble recently, that whole generation, and remembering what an impact and why Star Trek was like God-smackingly different, even though now we've got 27 different Star Trek. So I want to thank everybody who's been sounding off at Second Opinion, at all my threads, anybody who is people who are in the comment sections now online. We have something we didn't have 20, 30 years ago. We had to subscribe to a magazine to have interaction. We had to subscribe to Interstat to have the high-end Star Trek fandom opinion making going back and forth, even if that got nasty and a little anal and a little precious at times. But we have this thing now, and it's not even the message boards of the 80s and 90s where people could get all personal. I mean, it's pretty out in the open and public, and the mundane world can kind of intrude when they want to. And yeah, bots and trolls can skew results and inflame passions just to see us divided. But have your opinions. Be sincere, but be respectful. Be aware that you may be being played at times by third parties who want nothing to do with but the discussion, the debate, the critiquing, that's always been there. We've always had that. We just have new means to get at it. And I think we're having a swing back toward the importance of local clubs, or at least the away meets, the meetups for discussions. Those are all we've gone back to enjoying our live meetups and people. And it may not just be you and your four best buds at a bar having your debates. It may be a lot, a nice. I've never met any hateful, toxic tubers. I know they've been at cons, but I've never come across anyone in my face who would have your opinion and disagree with me. But the virulent, horrible excess that exhausts people online never seems to turn up live. Fancy that. But here we are, in an episode that was all about unmasking the Breen and advancing the plot in a really interesting way with these two couples. The more I thought about it, the old bugaboo of fighting over the Enterprise, which made me sad in the beginning. But I'm a realist. And unless you want to go torpedo the franchise and burn it all down, you move on. And when you move on, those smooth heads and bumpy heads might give you fodder for a whole range of amazing other stories. We may get there, and it may take a while to get nailed down to where it doesn't seem like just a poor excuse to cover up your undisciplined story urges, but we'll eventually get there. I'm not exactly sure how and why, but I know I've been amazed at the things we worried about in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. And we'll get there. We'll get there. But whatever we do, let's be civil. And my TTLers, I know you're the civil types. If you're watching me later on YouTube, please sound off. Please tell me exactly what you're thinking and what you're feeling. But just do it in a respectful way. Can you please? Absolute adjectives that just crush all semblance of leaving a little room of doubt at the end, a little uncertainty. Maybe you're 90% sure, but there's still 10% could be a wobble. Those adjectives and adverbs that just supremely, this is the way, they kind of tend to discourage discussion. And is that really what you want? Especially if you're feeling frustrated at what you just saw on screen and you know that it's out there forever until somebody sometime down the line says, well, when Janice Lester said the world of women isn't involved in your world of starship captains, somebody down the line says, you know what? She was not a well person. Was she speaking for the entire history and sociology wing of the Federation when she made that sentence? Or was she just an aggrieved, not well, little jealous, rejected girlfriend? And whatever it is, whether it's blinky lights or Canon like that, texture not trivia gang, camera battery ran low. This has been a long one today, but I wanted to connect all these dots in one place at one time. I hope I kept everybody. I hope I didn't lose anyone, but I just wanted to cover all that ground together. If you stayed with me on YouTube, thanks for everybody live who's here. And if you're still here with this YouTube later, boy, I really, really, really want to hear from you in the comments. This could potentially be a comment thread that outdoes the live show. We'll probably take a low end on the comments here as we get to chat. But if you're watching us on YouTube only, appreciate you jumping by. If you made it this far, I hope I gave you lots of fodder to comment on. So please get your thoughts together. And please remember that we're here thanks to our TTLers. Would you do that for me, please? Diana Hopkins, Robin Wilson, Lawrence Todd, Josh Patton, Justin Porteous, Glinda Bruton, Chris Jiggins, Pranakasha Productions, Comedy Forecast, Andrew Grzymski. Boy, this camera thing just threw me. That was amazing. Robert McLean, Byron Bailey, J.R. Pohl, Hubbard Gunnjonson, Alan Hohensey, Dave Gregory, Tobias Rex, Donna S. Runyon, Greg Wickstrom, and Casey Shufsky. And again, if you won't always be an hour and a half, kids, but patreon.com/Trekland Live, $5, $10 every month. It's a very simple Patreon. I appreciate your support. I always talk about the Trek Files as a reminder. We're on hiatus, but there's 11 seasons, 24 episodes a season sitting there at our page, Facebook, or you can go to podcast.roddenberry.com or any places you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, Apple, yada, yada. The documents, the files, the actual files are only at our Facebook page, though, Facebook/The Trek Files. Thank you so much. And again, if it's getting to the word summer and you're getting the itch to come to LA and you want to, yeah, sure, you can go to Vasquez Rocks on your own. But I would urge you to hit me up and see if we can fix you up your own custom 4 sites day tour on your own Trekland Treks. Love to talk to you about it and work that out, you and your group. And of course, it's Larry Nemecek on Twitter X. It's Larry's Trekland for where you are. Like and subscribe. Please share this. Instagram and Facebook. And portal47.net for your backstage mini-con all year long. A lot of the ideas not just the backstage creators, but we try to keep up with the business news. We try to keep up with the meta of Star Trek. By the time it gets to the screen that you enjoy, what affected that and what is often not talked about? It's changed a lot since this is our 8th year, coming up to our 8th year. Things have altered a lot. But no, I'm sorry, our 9th year. We've come a long way talking about some of these beyond just what was the last popular actor said in his Twitter. We've come a long way toward exploring Star Trek, the Trek that reaches you and why, and how it was done in the past and why. I enjoy that. I enjoy that so much. Keeps me fresh. Our community keeps me fresh. And like right now. If you're leaving us here on YouTube, please, everybody, just till next time, would you? Do all the things. Stay healthy. And check your sources. Stay woke. Interesting times. And trek well.